The morning haze over the Solomon Sea had a way of swallowing distances, turning the world into a muted watercolor of pale blue sky and darker blue water merging without a horizon. At 20,000 feet, condensation streaked across the canopy of Charles MacDonald's P-38 Lightning as he held station to the right of his wingman. The twin Allison engines hummed at cruise power, a sound so steady it almost masked the tension coiled in his gut. It was the early hours of October the 25th, 1943, and the sun had only just begun to burn away the tropical overcast that hung like a curtain over New Britain. Ahead of them, Rabaul lay, concealed beneath its usual veil of moisture and volcanic haze. To American crews, the Japanese fortress was less a city and more an idea, an armed citadel crouched beneath clouds, a place where anti-aircraft bursts waited like invisible predators. But this morning, MacDonald was not escorting bombers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He was leading a small formation of P-38s on a fighter sweep, one of the most dangerous tasks in the Southwest Pacific. No bombers to defend, no targets to strike, just a simple and brutal directive. Find whatever Japanese aircraft were operating out of Rabaul and eliminate them before they reached Allied forces. Through the thick tropical air, MacDonald spotted the first faint glints, reflections of metal, like silver needles pricking through the haze. He eased his throttle forward, feeling the lightning respond with that familiar surge. He keyed his radio, his voice steady even as his heartbeat quickened. "Bandits, 11 o'clock, multiple, keep it tight." In the seconds that followed, the haze thinned just enough to reveal what those reflections were: a layered mass of Japanese aircraft lifting off the airfields around Simpson Harbor and climbing in loose, staggered formations, fighters, Zeeks most likely, escorting bombers that were beginning their ascent into the morning sky. MacDonald felt the knot in his stomach loosen in a strange way. Fear shifted into focus, nerves transformed into intent. He had been in the Pacific for months. He had led men into combat. He had scored victories, but he had never seen a target-rich sky quite like this morning. The timing was perfect, dangerously perfect. Japanese aircraft climbing slowly, engines straining at full power, not yet at their fighting altitude, not yet ready to maneuver. MacDonald knew exactly what this opportunity meant. And he also knew the cost of hesitation. He rolled the Lightning slightly, lined up the loose climbing column of fighters, and pressed his throttle through the detent. The P-38 surged into a shallow dive, the weight of the aircraft shifting against his harness, the nose-mounted guns steadied in his sight picture. For a moment, everything went silent. At least inside his head, no thoughts of fuel, no thoughts of engine temperatures, no thoughts of the risks of diving toward a fortress city defended by some of Japan's most experienced pilots. Just the cold clarity of an opportunity that came once in a career. This is where the story begins. One of the most extraordinary P-38 combat sorties flown by an American pilot in the entire Pacific War. A morning in which Charles MacDonald delivered a performance so astonishing that the legend around it would grow far beyond the documented truth. By the time the war ended, men would say he shot down 7 planes in 20 minutes, a figure repeated in mess halls and tent-side conversations like a myth whispered into permanence. But the real story, what actually happened, what he actually saw, thought, feared, and endured, was far more compelling than the legend. To understand why, and to understand how a single pilot could achieve 5 confirmed victories in one morning in the skies over Rabaul, we must first step backward into the world that shaped him, a world in which the P-38 Lightning was both a symbol of American engineering ambition and a machine still misunderstood by many of the men who flew it. A world in which the Southwest Pacific was not a battlefield of sweeping cinematic engagements, but a grinding war of logistics, attrition, exhaustion, and distances so vast that they changed the nature of aerial combat. By the autumn of 1943, the American 5th Air Force had become one of the most relentless striking forces in the Pacific. But it was not quantity that defined their operations. It was persistence. The war in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands had taught the Americans lessons that no pre-war textbook had prepared them for. The Japanese Army and Navy were not simply dug in. They were embedded into the terrain, supplied by narrow jungle trails, and defended by fighter units hardened by the earliest victories of the war. For pilots like MacDonald, this meant that every sortie required navigating not only enemy aircraft, but also the elements themselves. Afternoon thunderstorms rose like walls. Turbulence over the Owen Stanley Range could tear a formation apart. Fuel consumption had to be monitored with a kind of religious devotion. A pilot who misjudged his return distance did not simply land short of his field. He vanished into the sea or the jungle. Yet the P-38 Lightning offered something no other American fighter in the Pacific could match: range. Real, usable, mission-shaping range. Its twin engines, turbo superchargers, and fuel capacity allowed it to reach Rabaul from Allied bases in New Guinea, something the P-40 and P-47 could not yet do. MacDonald understood the Lightning's strengths well. By the time he took command of the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, he had already absorbed the lessons of pilots who had paid for their knowledge with their lives. He knew that the Lightning's climb rate at altitude, its diving speed, and its concentrated nose armament were decisive advantages if used correctly. He also understood the aircraft's vulnerabilities: heavy control forces at high speeds, compressibility effects in steep dives, and the difficulty of fighting multiple Zeeks at low altitude, where the Japanese aircraft's light weight allowed it to roll and turn with startling speed. This was the world MacDonald carried into the air each morning, a world defined by the realities of attrition, the mathematics of fuel consumption, the unpredictable behavior of tropical weather, and the relentless pressure of leadership. His men looked to him for stability, for decisiveness, for an example of how to survive long enough to complete a combat tour. They also looked to him because MacDonald was, by all accounts, a natural tactician. He did not rely on instinct alone. He absorbed reports, debriefings, and fragments of intelligence with a meticulous eye. He memorized the climb rates of enemy fighters at different altitudes. He studied the typical Japanese response times from various airfields around Rabaul. He watched how Zeeks reacted when surprised during takeoff. Which brings us back to that morning haze over Simpson Harbor and the moment when MacDonald realized he had caught the Japanese Air Forces in the middle of their climb. That this was no ordinary fighter sweep. It was a meeting of preparation and timing, a dangerous convergence created by the unpredictability of war. To understand why the Japanese formations were climbing at that moment, we need to step back even further into the strategic reality of the late 1943 campaign around Rabaul. Rabaul, the so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific, was not simply a base. It was a fortress built across multiple airfields: Lakunai, Vunakanau, Tobera, and Rapapo, each carved from the dense greenery of New Britain. By 1943, the Japanese maintained more than 300 aircraft across these fields, though never all at once and rarely all operational. Bombing raids, maintenance shortages, disease, and the increasingly thin supply line from the home islands meant that the air defenses fluctuated constantly. But when operational strength aligned with sufficient warning, Japanese pilots could flood the sky with a density of fighters unmatched anywhere else in the Pacific. The Americans knew this all too well. For the 5th Air Force, approaching Rabaul was an act of controlled recklessness. Allied intelligence estimated that Japanese radar installations near Rabaul could detect incoming aircraft at distances of more than 100 miles. This meant that any bomber or fighter formation would be met by an ascending wave of Zeeks, often maneuvered by some of Japan's most experienced pilots, men who had fought since the early days of China and who had survived the grueling Guadalcanal campaign. This made what MacDonald saw that morning so unusual. The Japanese fighters were climbing too slowly, too disorganizedly, too predictably. Some later speculated that ground controllers had underestimated how quickly the American P-38s would arrive. Others suggested that the Japanese were launching a staggered scramble because earlier raids had damaged communication lines, disrupting coordination between the airfields. There is no confirmed answer. What we do know comes from pilot debriefs, post-war interviews, and the patterns of Japanese defensive doctrine. MacDonald likely understood the situation within seconds. A scattered, climbing enemy was the one moment in which even a small American fighter sweep could land a devastating blow. He leveled out, behind the first loose column of Zeeks. His gun sight steadied. The Lightning's nose dipped a fraction. This was the moment that would become, in later retellings, the beginning of his 7 in 20 legend. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the reality is more interesting. 5 confirmed victories, each achieved against targets that were maneuverable, unpredictable, and flown by pilots who were anything but inexperienced. To unpack the truth of what happened next, what MacDonald saw, what he thought about the Japanese formations, what he remembered years later, we have to understand the machinery he was flying. The P-38 was unlike any other fighter in the war, and not just externally. The twin-boom layout, the central nacelle, the tricycle landing gear, these were visible differences. But the heart of the Lightning's success lay deeper, in the details of its engineering and the doctrine that evolved around it. Twin engines meant survivability. A pilot who lost one engine at altitude could still limp home. The turbo-supercharged Allisons provided power at heights where many Japanese aircraft gasped for air. The nose-mounted armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns, and a 20mm cannon meant the Lightning could project a stream of fire that remained cohesive across distances that wing-mounted guns could not match. MacDonald's men used to say that when you squeezed the trigger, the Lightning didn't spray so much as carve. All of this mattered on that October morning, because MacDonald was diving into a sky not only crowded with enemy aircraft, but also layered with the dangers of his own aircraft's limits. If he descended too steeply, compressibility could lock his controls. If he remained too long at low altitude, Zeeks could swarm him with their tight-turning circles. If he focused too long on a single target, he would lose the situational awareness that kept fighter pilots alive. War in the Pacific was a study in these small calculations. Every decision, when to dive, when to level out, when to defeat, carried consequences, measured not in minutes, but in fractions of seconds. MacDonald fired the first burst at a climbing Zeke that had just broken left. The Japanese pilot never saw him. The shells found their mark, and the aircraft erupted in a burst of flame that vanished into the haze below. MacDonald pulled up, scanned, rolled right, and picked the next target. He was in the middle of the first attack run of a sequence that would become one of the most remarkable performances by any American pilot in the Southwest Pacific. And this is where we pause for the first time, not to break the story, but to take in the world that made this moment possible. A world of misjudged intelligence reports, of exhausted Japanese ground crews, of American pilots flying the limits of their machines, of the shifting tides that in late 1943 were beginning to turn in favor of the Allies, but had not yet granted them safety. This was not a myth, not a legend born in a bar after the war. This was a real pilot, in a real aircraft, facing real men in the skies, over a hostile stronghold. A pilot who would emerge from this morning with 5 confirmed victories and a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. If you're ready, I'll continue with the next section, the moment when MacDonald's beliefs collided with the reality of Rabaul's air defenses, and the 20-minute period in which his actions would define a chapter of the air war in the Southwest Pacific. The second kill had not yet fallen away into smoke before MacDonald felt the full weight of what he had flown into. The sky above Rabaul was no longer a disorganized slime of scattered aircraft. It was turning into a hornet's nest. The Japanese response, delayed for reasons he would never fully understand, was now accelerating with a fury he could feel even through the vibrations of the Lightning's control column. To his left, a cluster of Zeeks rolled sharply upward, their silhouettes dark against the thinning haze. To his right, another formation broke apart as pilots realized that American fighters were already among them. Below him, fresh aircraft continued to claw their way into the sky from the airfields around Simpson Harbor, their engines leaving thin, pale trails that twisted in the morning light. MacDonald had no illusions. Surprise never lasted in the Pacific, not against veterans who had fought since the days of China and Malaya. He squeezed his microphone in one hand, eyes scanning for friendlies. Keep moving. Single passes only. Don't get slow. It was as much a reminder to himself as to his men. The P-38 was a magnificent predator in a dive. It was also a coffin for pilots who allowed themselves to get caught in a slow-speed turn fight with Zeeks. MacDonald had drilled this into his squadron repeatedly. Stay fast, stay high, stay unpredictable. You fought the Zero on your terms or not at all. He rolled right, pulled the Lightning's nose into the path of a Zeke that was just leveling out after its climb. The Japanese pilot saw him too late. MacDonald glimpsed the sudden flare of sunlight on a canopy as the Zeke snapped left in a desperate break. He led the turn, fired a controlled burst, and watched the tracers reach out and stitch across the enemy's fuselage. The aircraft jerked violently, smoke trailing, then spiraled downward. 3. He had been in the fight less than 3 minutes, but victories meant nothing if the sky itself strangled you. Below, the terrain was rising, a deadly illusion created by the volcanic ridges around Rabaul. MacDonald had seen more than one rookie pilot die, not because of enemy guns, but because they descended into the deceptive folds of the island's landscape. He eased back on the throttle, climbed, and looked over his shoulder. That was when he saw them. A wall of Zeeks, perhaps 8, maybe more, were angling up toward him in a loose climbing fan. They were not coordinated, not in the tight formations Japanese units sometimes flew during the early years of the war, but they were numerous, close enough to support each other, and climbing with that unnerving agility the Zero possessed when still low and slow. MacDonald felt a flicker of instinctive calculation. Not quite fear, not yet, not while he still had altitude and speed, but he recognized the pattern. He had seen Japanese pilots do this many times, scatter on initial contact, reform into hunting pairs and trios, then press from multiple angles until they forced a lightning into a turning engagement. The solution was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Do not let them choose the fight. He rolled into a climbing right turn, using altitude as both shield and weapon. The Lightning bit into the move with its characteristic heaviness, slower to respond than the Japanese fighters, but powerful once its mass was committed. The sun glinted off the top of his canopy as he came around and found another Zeke crossing beneath him. He waited half a second, half a heartbeat, then kicked rudder, dropped the nose, and fired. A short burst, clean, controlled. No spray. The Zeke disintegrated in a flash of orange flame. 4. MacDonald did not celebrate. He barely acknowledged the number. He had flown enough missions to know that counting victories in the moment was a luxury pilots rarely survived long enough to enjoy. What mattered was the next move, the next threat. A shadow flashed across his canopy. He jerked left, hard. A Zeke shot past him so close he could see the chipped paint on the cowling, the pilot's white scarf snapping in the slipstream. The Japanese fighter overshot. Too fast, too eager. And MacDonald felt a thin blade of opportunity slide open, just wide enough to fit through if he was willing to risk it. He dove. The Lightning plunged, engines screaming as the turbo superchargers wound up like sirens. Wind hammered the canopy. The controls stiffened. Compressibility nipped at the edge of the airframe, but not enough to lock it up. Not yet. The Zeke tried to follow, but the dive belonged to the P-38. It always had. The Japanese fighter hung in the air above him, unable to match the Lightning's weight-driven drop. MacDonald pulled back, smoothly. Too hard risked blackout. Too soft risked losing the angle. He came up beneath the Zeke, lifted the nose, and fired a burst that tore through the enemy aircraft's engine and cockpit. The Zero blossomed into a smoking cloud, pieces shearing away as it tumbled into the sea. Five victories in a morning so young it still smelled of salt and burning mist. And yet the fight was shifting. What MacDonald did not know, what no one in his formation could know, was that Japanese ground controllers had finally begun pushing every available fighter into the air. Aircraft that were not fully warmed up, aircraft with minimal ammunition, aircraft flown by pilots shaken awake, sprinted to their cockpits and thrown into battle with only seconds of preparation. They were coming, now, a rising swarm, a tightening noose. MacDonald scanned the sky again and saw that the haze above Rabaul had transformed into a layered chaos of contrails, spirals, and thin streaks of black smoke. The fight was no longer isolated. It was spreading, growing. And somewhere in that mess were his men. He leveled off, keyed his radio. "Angel flights, check in." Static. Then a voice. Thin, distant, but alive. "2 here. Engaged west of Tobera." Another. "4's clear. Low on ammo." Another, breathless. "6. I got one on me." The transmission cut off. MacDonald did not hesitate. This was no longer about victory counts or exploiting the moment of surprise. This was the part of leadership that weighed heavier than any enemy formation. Find your men, keep them alive. He pushed the throttle forward, banked sharply toward the western edge of the harbor, and disappeared into the rising turbulence of a sky that was rapidly filling with enemies. What happened next would test not only his skill, but the very limits of what the P-38 could endure in sustained combat. And in the chaos that followed, MacDonald would experience the moment that shaped his reputation more than any confirmed victory. A moment pilots would talk about for years afterward, even when the numbers became blurred by myth. The western edge of Simpson Harbor was a place where pilots often disappeared. Not because the terrain itself was inherently deadly, though the jagged volcanic ridges could swallow an aircraft whole, but because that quadrant of the Rabaul airspace was where disorganized dogfights often migrated when formations broke apart. Pilots in trouble instinctively turned away from the harbor's guns, climbing or diving toward the open sea or the fluted ridges of the Gazelle Peninsula. It was also where Japanese reinforcements tended to enter the fight, racing upward from Rabaul or Tobera like hornets erupting from a nest. MacDonald knew all this. He also knew that one of his men, callsign 6, had just cried for help in a tone that made MacDonald's stomach tighten. He shoved the twin throttles to combat power, the Allisons roaring as the lightning surged forward. The control column vibrated slightly, a subtle reminder that the aircraft was nearing its optimal climb for the power setting he had chosen. He nudged the nose upward, but not too steeply. Climbing too hard would burn fuel and bleed speed, and speed was the one thing that kept a P-38 alive in Zero Country. The haze was thinning now. Sunlight struck the tops of the scattered clouds and refracted into hard white bands that cut across the canopy. Beneath him, the harbor's water reflected the light back upward, an effect that made it difficult to spot aircraft below, but perfect for illuminating those above. He caught a glimpse of 2 Zeeks circling each other like wolves, searching for prey. Then he saw it, a P-38 below, rolling desperately left and right, its pilot trying everything short of an inverted dive to shake a Zero glued to his tail. The Japanese pilot was good. Too good. He matched every move, held the inside turn, and fired short, rhythmic bursts that flashed like small sparks. 6 was doomed unless someone intervened within seconds. MacDonald didn't think. He didn't weigh options. He didn't calculate angles like he had been trained to in stateside simulators. He simply acted. He pushed his nose down and dove. The dive was shallow at first, just enough to build speed without overshooting the fight. But then he saw the Japanese pilot pull lead on 6's turn, lining up the final burst. MacDonald had made a decision that pilots were taught not to make, unless the situation was catastrophic. He steepened the dive. The lightning responded instantly, its weight pulling it forward into a gravity-fed plunge. The airspeed indicator leapt upward. The canopy rattled. The nose vibrated as turbulent air clawed at the airframe. He felt the first prickling edge of compressibility, threatening to stiffen the controls. Too fast, too steep. But if he backed off now, 6 would die. MacDonald lined up the Zero and fired a burst at the very instant he flashed past. The tracers didn't just miss, their path wasn't even close. He was diving too fast for accurate fire, and the Japanese pilot, seeing the P-38 streaking down from above, broke hard right and away. But that bought 6 a few seconds, but it didn't solve the problem. And in that moment, MacDonald made a choice that later pilots would marvel at, and some would privately criticize. He pulled the Lightning out of the dive, not by easing back gently, but by muscling the aircraft through the thickening resistance of the controls. The airframe groaned. The wings flexed. The altitude dropped so fast that for an instant he wondered if he miscalculated entirely. But he recovered. Barely. He felt the aircraft shudder as it climbed back into the fight. Now behind the Zeke that had been chasing 6. The Japanese pilot, realizing what had happened, banked away, but not fast enough. MacDonald squeezed the trigger and fired a measured burst that crossed the Zeke's tail, then the fuselage, then the engine cowling. The Zero erupted into a bloom of flame and smoke, disintegrating before dropping into the water. 6's voice crackled through the radio, breathless. Jesus. Thanks, Mac. I was out. MacDonald didn't answer. There wasn't time. He scanned the sky and realized the situation had worsened dramatically. What had been a scattered skirmish 15 minutes earlier was now an expanding vortex of combat. Japanese reinforcements were pouring upward from multiple airfields. The Americans, fewer in number, were scattered across several miles of airspace, each locked into individual fights that grew more chaotic by the second. MacDonald counted at least 10 Zekes climbing toward him in loose elements, and perhaps 4 or 5 more milling above. He keyed the radio. All flights tighten up. Stay high if you can. If you're low, head east and climb. Static. A few garbled responses. Too many pilots were too deep in the fight to break clear. MacDonald banked the Lightning into a wider turn to regain situational awareness. He saw at least 3 separate dogfights unfolding around him. One P-38 low over the ridges, pursued by 2 Zekes flying in the tight, predatory style that reminded him of experienced China hands. A swirling 3-on-1 further north, the Lightning pulling brutal high-G turns that were bleeding its energy dangerously fast. A pair of Zekes diving from altitude, likely trying to pick off isolated Americans as they emerged from their fights. He knew he couldn't help them all. Leadership in combat was not glamorous. It was choosing who you could save without sacrificing the entire flight. He had seen commanders lose their entire unit by charging blindly into hopeless rescues. He refused to be one of them. He chose the fight he could influence now, the 3-on-1. He rolled hard, dove again, and used the P-38's superior acceleration to close the distance. The American pilot, callsign 2, was doing everything right. He kept his turns wide, used vertical climb and dive to stay unpredictable, and never let the Zekes herd him into a low-speed, flat turning circle. But he was running out of sky. MacDonald came in from high, 6 o'clock, his altitude advantage translating into raw kinetic energy. The Zekes spotted him late and broke formation, one pulling high, one dropping low, the third veering off to the right. MacDonald went for the high one first. The climb of the Zero was exceptional at low speeds, but in a sustained vertical maneuver, the P-38 had the advantage, especially when entering already fast. He followed the Zeke upward, waited until the moment the Japanese pilot hung on the propeller and fired. The burst struck home. The Zeke burst into flames and fell like a stone. The second Zeke dove into the ridges, weaving in a series of frantic jinks. MacDonald could have followed, but he didn't. A low pursuit into the rising terrain around Rabaul was a trap. Many Americans had died that way, tricked into sharp banking maneuvers that bled speed and offered the Zero the turning fight it wanted. He let that one go and swung toward the third. The last Zeke in the trio tried a scissors maneuver, likely hoping to force MacDonald to overshoot. But the P-38, with its tricycle landing gear and wide stance, could yaw and sideslip in ways that surprised enemy pilots. MacDonald matched the scissors for 2 passes, then kicked rudder, rolled right, and snapped the nose ahead of the Zero's predicted line. A burst, a puff of smoke, a spiraling descent, another kill, but not one he could claim alone. Combat reports later listed it only as a probable. Two's voice came through, shaking but alive. "I'm clear. Climbing east." MacDonald watched him bank toward the distant line of cumulus clouds that marked safety. But safety was a relative concept. Every pilot knew that even a clean escape from Rabaul meant an hour-long flight back to New Guinea, an hour in which fuel might run low, engines might fail, or a stray Japanese aircraft might shadow them home. But at least 2 would live long enough to try. MacDonald climbed again, the lightning straining as it gained altitude. The sky above was thinning. Some Zeeks were retreating east, possibly low on fuel. Others were regrouping to re-enter the fight. The air around him shimmered with heat from the shizzing tropical day, creating optical illusions that made aircraft appear to stretch or warp in the distance. A sudden flash of silver caught his eye. A P-38 spinning, out of control. MacDonald's heart dropped for a beat. But then he saw the chute deploy. A small white flower in the sky. The pilot floated downward, drifting toward the jungle below. He would likely be captured, but captured was not dead, and for now, that small distinction mattered. MacDonald turned back toward the center of the airspace, just as a warning instinct, older than conscious thought, made him break left. A Zeke shot past, guns blazing. The suddenness of the attack rattled him. The Japanese pilot had approached from below and behind, exploiting the one blind spot in the lightning's rear visibility. MacDonald slammed the throttles forward and dove. The Zeke followed. For 10 seconds, MacDonald's world narrowed to the sound of his engines, the pounding rattle of the canopy, and the knowledge that one mistake, one wrong bank, one hesitation, meant death. He performed a shallow descending spiral, a maneuver designed to trap a pursuing fighter into tightening the turn and bleeding energy. The Zeke stayed tight, too tight. The Japanese pilot was trying to force the P-38 into a low-speed trap. MacDonald felt the familiar heaviness in the controls that warned he was nearing the lower edge of the lightning's comfort zone. If he slowed any more, the Zero would win the turn. He made his move. He chopped the throttles, rolled inverted, and dove vertically. The Zeke tried to follow, but lost control authority in the sudden transition. MacDonald pulled out at high speed, rolled back upright, and came up behind the Zero as it attempted to recover. He fired. The Zero exploded into flame, debris scattering across the sky. As the smoke cleared, MacDonald finally took a breath. His suit was soaked with sweat. His legs trembled slightly. His fuel gauge told him that the fight had gone on far longer than he realized. He had perhaps 20 minutes of fuel left before he would need to turn home. And the sky was finally thinning. The Japanese fighters were retreating, some damaged, some low on fuel, some simply unwilling to chase the Americans farther from Rabaul's protective umbrella. The Americans were withdrawing as well, battered and scattered. MacDonald leveled off, scanned the sky one more time, and called, "All flights, form on heading 150, let's go home." One by one, voices crackled in, some strong, some trembling, some missing entirely. MacDonald felt the weight of command settle over him with the same heaviness as the humid air. They had survived. Not all of them, but most. As he turned southward, the P-38, steady now in cruise power, he realized something he would carry for the rest of his life. In the space of 20 minutes, he had flown one of the most extraordinary combat sequences of his career. 10 confirmed victories, several probables, a flight saved from collapse. But it had not felt like heroism. It had felt like survival, like responsibility, like the brutal arithmetic of war, forcing him to choose again and again between impossible options. The legend, the whispered 7 in 20, would come later, inflated by retellings and awe. But the truth was far more compelling. Because MacDonald had not flown for numbers, he had flown for his men. The return flight from Rabaul was always the quietest part of any mission, And that morning was no exception. The adrenaline drained slowly, leaving behind a stillness that made every engine vibration feel louder, every flicker of the fuel gauges more ominous. MacDonald held the Lightning on a steady southerly line, his gloves damp, his arms aching, and his mind replaying the fight in fragments, brief, searing flashes rather than a coherent memory. He looked to his left and saw another P-38 limping along, one engine feathered, its pilot nursing it home with the practiced desperation of someone who understood exactly how far the airfield lay. To the right, two more Lightnings flew in a loose, weary trail. No one spoke on the radio. Not from discipline, but from exhaustion. The ocean beneath them stretched out like a vast, merciless mirror. It was beautiful in a way MacDonald could never fully appreciate while flying over it, because he knew how many pilots had vanished into that same glittering expanse, their stories ending in silence. He checked fuel again. Enough to make it. Barely. They landed at Dobadura one by one, wheels touching down in the thick, humid air of New Guinea. Ground crews ran out to meet them, not with celebration, but with the clinical urgency of men who understood that pilots needed water, medics needed information, and aircraft needed inspection. When MacDonald stepped off the wing and onto the dirt, his legs wobbled. He removed his helmet, wiped sweat from his eyes, and inhaled the heavy scent of wet jungle earth mixed with engine oil. Someone placed a canteen in his hand. Someone else asked him how many he got. He didn't answer. Not immediately. He needed the debrief first. Inside the briefing tent, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and quiet voices. A map of Rabaul lay spread across the table, marked with pins that had been placed there so often they had worn small holes into the canvas. Intelligence officers asked their questions with a kind of detached precision. Numbers, positions, timings. MacDonald answered each one carefully, resisting the temptation to compress the chaos into a tidy narrative. He gave the facts, 5 confirmed. Others would later confirm 2 additional kills within the same window of time. But MacDonald did not claim them. He never did. The intelligence officer across from him leaned back, eyebrows raised. 5 in one sortie, he said softly. That's something. MacDonald shrugged. It was a target-rich sky. But the truth was more complicated. He had saved men. He had fought against overwhelming numbers. He had pushed the P-38 to its limits and stepped close, too close, to the edge of its aerodynamic envelope. He had also survived when others hadn't. That was the part no statistic could soften. By evening, word had already begun to spread. Pilots who hadn't flown that morning asked for details. Men in other squadrons heard fragments of the story through the grapevine. Numbers shifted, blurred, grew. Someone said 6. Someone else repeated, maybe 7. Someone heard 7 in 20 minutes and repeated it the way men repeat stories they want to believe. It was not malicious. It was human. In a war defined by attrition and fatigue, extraordinary moments became talismans. Stories men held onto because they proved that skill still mattered, that courage still counted, that survival wasn't merely luck. MacDonald corrected people when he heard the inflated number. He didn't believe in myths, not when real men were dying. But the legend grew anyway, living its own life in tent-side conversations, barroom whispers, and later in the histories written by those who had not been there in the haze over Simpson Harbor years later. When the war had ended and the Pacific had become a memory softened by time, MacDonald would be asked about that morning again. Again, interviewers wanted to know what he felt, what he thought, whether he knew he was on the edge of something historic. His answer was always the same. I was fighting to keep my men alive, that's all. He never spoke of fear in dramatic terms. He never dressed up the confusion or the luck. And he never claimed more than he earned. His official tally for the day remained 5, enough to earn distinction, enough to place him among the most effective fighter leaders in the Pacific, more than enough to remind him how thin the line between skill and death had been. The men he saved remembered that day differently. For them, it was not about victory counts. It was about the moment a shadow passed overhead, a P-38 diving like an avenging blade, and a Zero that had been seconds from killing them burst into fire instead. Years later, at reunions, they would clasp his shoulder and say, "Mac, you pulled me out of hell that morning." He would smile, shake his head, and answer, "We all pulled each other out." That humility was part of why the 475th Fighter Group followed him without hesitation, why they trusted his judgment, why his name appeared in memoirs not in bold strokes, but in quiet admiration between the lines. Because, in the end, what mattered wasn't the myth, it was the man. On that October morning over Rabaul, Charles MacDonald didn't become a legend. He became something rarer, a leader whose courage was measured not by glory, but by responsibility. A man who fought not for numbers, but for the lives flying beside him. A pilot who understood that the sky was indifferent, the enemy relentless, and survival the only victory worth claiming. And that is the truth that remains when the smoke clears and the guns go silent. Heroes are not made by the stories told about them. They are made by the choices they carry alone, high above the sea, where only they can see what must be done and do it anyway. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.